So this is the same track I was starting in my last tutorial. I wanted to come back later on in the production process to illustrate a pretty different way that we can use sensory percussion in production that we didn't really talk about. So last time we were talking about tracking sensory percussion sounds and a performance and how we can keep audio passing through the plugin to keep things flexible. Today we're going to get a little more abstract. We're going to utilize controllers to automate parameters in our mix. I'm going to be using Ableton Live and the sensory percussion plugin in this, but we're sending MIDI from the sensory percussion plugin to the IAC bus with this MIDI track. And if I pull this up over here, you can see this is just taking MIDI from the sensory percussion plugin and sending it out on the IAC, which is just a virtual MIDI port. So you could totally do this with sensory standalone and some kind of virtual port going into any other DAW. So for an easy to follow example, let's just use velocity to modulate a filter cutoff on this synth stem I have right here. This section I thought I could use a little something. It's a cool sound. But I thought it'd be fun to try to throw some extra motion in there. So the way I'm going to do this, I already have a kit set up in sensory percussion. Notice that there are no samples on anything, and I'm just using one drum. And on the MIDI tab, I'm not even using MIDI notes at all, but I am sending CC1 out, and I'm using velocity to control that. If I pull up my synth chain, I already have this auto filter set up on here. So to create the mapping, I can just go into MIDI mapping mode, Command M on a Mac, select the parameter I want to modulate, and then wiggle the knob that I want to modulate it with. And that's all it takes to create that connection. And when I play my drum, you can see that I'm moving this filter. And to exaggerate this, I'm just going to boost the resonance so it's like super obvious what's going on here. So already you can see that the kind of modulation we're getting from this with the velocity controller is kind of jumpy, but it's still expressive because it's reflecting how hard I'm playing. So if we go ahead and record it, we can see this a little bit more. And note that I do have automation armed. Cool. Let's zoom in on this a little bit and see what's going on here. Each one of these nodes is basically every time I hit the drum, and the velocity is reflected in how high the automation value is. So if you've done any automating with the pencil tool, you know that this kind of thing would be really annoying to make. Of course it can be done. I would like to submit that this is a great workflow because I created this involved automation in a really organic way. I was literally just jamming along to this with my drum to create this automation. There is one caveat to this workflow, which is apparent as soon as I try to play this back. I got this somewhat pesky re-enable automation button. This is going to happen every time I try to play this because I have my MIDI mapping still set up to control that. And the simplest workaround to this is to just delete the mapping. Now I can go out of MIDI mapping, re-enable automation, and I can play it like you would expect. Nice. That sounds pretty cool. I'm already really digging where this is right now. So now we can just do normal automation stuff, but we have this great starting point. And this might be perfect, or it might be that you want to nudge some things around a little bit. For instance, I often find that this automation lands just a tiny bit late, so I could just drag it back a tiny bit, and that usually makes things hit more how I intended. I could take this whole thing and scale it down a little bit or scale it up. I could whip out the pencil tool and be like, you know what, this one part here was just too much, and I could just trim it down like that. Before we get too carried away with this, I want to do this again, controlling the filter cutoff on this, but using an envelope controller instead, because that creates a really interesting modulation. So again, similar setup in this kit, no samples, no MIDI notes, just this envelope controller on CC1. And I can create that MIDI mapping again, just like we did before. So now every time I hit the drum, we're getting this really unique shape that happens. And what I love about this is that it's scaled to velocity. So if I hit it really soft, we get this tiny little wiggle, and then if I play harder, it's more exaggerated. So let's go ahead and record this and see what happens. So I did get a little fancy there, and while I was playing, I realized that I had this range set up a little too high. It was cool for a while, but it coming back to this one frequency at the bottom here got kind of annoying to me. So I just adjusted it manually with my other hand. I found myself doing that a lot because I usually create automation like this with just one drum. You don't have to do that in real time. I'm going to come back to this and show you a way that you can adjust controller parameters after the fact. Check out this crazy automation we just made. There are a ton of nodes here, and while that's kind of interesting and cool, I think it's nice to just use this simplify envelope tool, and what that does is it just gets rid of any unnecessary nodes, and it's very smart. You can see that it curved some of these shapes, which reflects the which preserves the exponential shape that I put on my controller here, which is really nice, and it's just easier on the eyes, and I don't know, maybe it's a CPU. So the only editing that I know I want to do is make this jump, making the transition from this controller setting to this controller setting a little smoother. So I might just grab a section of this and put it somewhere in the middle, create a little staircase kind of thing. Yeah, that's probably cool. And maybe I do want to drag it all over just a tiny bit. So just to land this plane and make this a little less ridiculous and more usable, I'm going to put this resonance back down. But something else that I think is going to make this really shine is actually duplicating the track, hard panning the two copies, and switching the filter mode on the second instance to high pass instead of low pass. So because they share the same automation, this is going to create a really interesting kind of stereo filter imaging. And it's not going to be as intense because when one cuts down, the other one is going up. In context, it's really quite subtle with that trick, but I think it makes it a lot more constructive and not distracting. Of course, we can create multiple automation lanes at once, and we can use as many controllers as we want to do that. Another part of this song that I think could use a little love is this part where the hi-hats come in for the first time. So this part has a cool swing to it already, but it kind of sticks out to me as being pretty static, and I even threw this some CV tools on this utility object to add a little motion, which I think really helps. But let's see what we could do to bring some more dimension into it by sort of drumming along to this section with some mappings. So I'm just going to use the drum bus for this, and I noticed that it sounds kind of interesting to play with this transients parameter. So what I thought I would do is, as I bring the transients up, I could bring this dampening down a little bit to counteract how that gets much louder. So I can open up sensory percussion again, go to the track of suspect. This will be my third example. And let's see, I'm using velocity on CC1, so let's use that for the dampening and transients sort of macro. And I have this other this speed controller here, and I'm going to use that on the drive and crunch parameters. So I can adjust the range of each one of these settings individually. I know that when I'm putting the transients up, I want to bring the dampening down a little bit, and not too much. We don't need this. This is just like a subtle softening. And then with the drive and crunch, maybe it doesn't need to go all the way to 100%. We'll just do something like that. I'm going to disarm automation this time, but I'm going to utilize the recorded sensor audio going through the plugin in real time as I play this back to hone in our controller settings a bit more. So, do another recording. And you can see those parameters are still moving. Even though they're not getting printed to the destination. Cool. Like I said, that automation is not reflected in this destination track. However, it is down here in this MIDI track that sends sensory percussion MIDI into the IAC bus. I can open this up and see that I have modulation on CC1 and CC2. And I could make edits here, but that's not really any different than what we were doing before. So what's going to be beneficial about this approach is if I actually delete this MIDI region, I can get away with that because I still have the sensor audio which is getting piped into the plugin. So I can play this back and you can see the automation is still happening because this region is playing through the plugin even right now, even though I'm not playing. I don't need to capture this performance again because we are running the performance through the plugin. So what this frees us up to do is make changes to the controllers to dial things in more. Let's say, for instance, I feel like this speed controller is jumping out a little too much. Something that might be helpful is to restore the sensitivity to the higher region so it doesn't just snap to its highest value, and adding a little bit more smoothing might help smooth things out. And then for kicks, why don't we do a little bit of smoothing here too. Making changes here is going to affect the MIDI that is output from sensory percussion, which is controlling the parameters here. So If I disarm the sensor input track because we don't need to capture a new performance, I could either just record this region and have that MIDI control this track's parameters, or I could re-engage, record automation, and then have those changes here. And that's going to make it a lot easier to see what's going on later. So let's go ahead and do that. Awesome. Now at this point I would have to go back and delete these MIDI mappings. No big deal. So we just created 4 lanes of automation all in one go, and I can make edits to all of these as I see fit, but for now I think it's great. So there are other ways to go about infusing automation via sensory percussion, but for the production workflow where we're not actually performing audio into the song, I found this to be the most efficient approach. If you're wanting to perform your song or big parts of it from sensory, you might end up with a lot of controllers and mappings, and those mappings can get pretty stacked and make that one caveat of having to delete the MIDI mappings feel like quite a risk. For Ableton Live users, that's one benefit of using this Max API controlled MIDI CC device. So I just strap that on the MIDI track that sends sensory percussion MIDI to the IAC, which in this case I wouldn't even need an output because we can use this device to create remote mappings without the whole MIDI mapping protocol. And that saves us the trouble of having to manage our MIDI mappings and re-enabling automation. So if you record your performance, leave the audio running through the plugin, which is spitting MIDI out, to this device, which is sending control signals to parameters in Ableton. And then you can tweak your controller settings in sensory, and you have all of these settings here, which are really quite powerful to dial in your expressive performance.